the projects that we're going to talk about is called Concept Danat. This is a English translation from French, and I believe it was a informal appeal. It actually looked at 3 projects, and we're just going to look at one right now, or one of the 3 within our examples. And it dealt with a company that's more of a marketing-based company that did printing on silks and t-shirts and developed kind of custom brands within that. So the project in question, or one of the projects in question, was one to do a type of laser printing on a fabric, and this type of laser was not meant to print on fabric. It was meant to etch plastics or harder materials, and the hypothesis of the developer here was that it could be adapted to meet their objectives in printing on fabric. So we're not told exactly what those are, other than that they want to print on fabric. We're not given quantified objectives, but we're told that some of the key variables that they look at are the thickness of the fabric, the power of the laser, and the speed and displacement of the laser. So reading through this case, I think it differentiates itself from, and the case was unsuccessful, so the taxpayer did not win here, but we can look at it and say, hey, I think I can understand some of the reasons here why the judge was not as happy with the results of this case as on the cases of A&D Precision or Formadrain who had won previously. All right, so one of the key things to look at is that it's informal appeal, so the total ITCs of all 3 projects were under $15,000. Okay, so it's generally not as sophisticated a claimant as ones where you're talking about A&D Precision, where the claims are in the millions of dollars. So Danat was a company with approximately 24 employees who was primarily in the manufacture and distribution of clothing with various embroidery, silk screening, and other kinds of transfer methods. The chief researcher was the president himself, Mr. Bourgeau, but we're not told about any technology background, relevant technology background. So again, that's one of the strikes against the claimant here, that typically they like to see someone with a Bachelor of Science or equivalent in charge of the technology, either in-house as an employee ideally, or via subcontract, one way or the other. So what we're told is that after an extensive internet search with different suppliers, the claimant was able to find a machine with laser etching technology that they thought might be able to engrave the tissues of the fabrics in question, but this machine was really made for harder materials, glass, plastic, metal, or wood. So basically they testified that this printer functions as a printer, so you could send a drawing to it, and that primarily the main parameters that they were going to experiment with were the power parameters, since there weren't any existing tables to predict that. They did additional work with a program called Adobe Illustrator to get additional controls, which would allow them to add shading to it. However, this software was recommended by the printer provider and was really meant to work with that machine as intended. So really, what Mr. Bourgeau argued is that there was different parameters for the power of the laser, the angles and the speed of the laser, along with the thickness of the tissue, and that those combined, those 3 variables, I guess, combined to create the technological uncertainty. The CRA's expert witness had an engineering background, Mr. Silla, and he basically felt that they were using commercial hardware within the parameters of the system, that the laser parameters were within the tolerances provided by the machine, and even though there were many possibilities, they weren't done systematically. Okay? The problem here is that there really aren't a lot of interrelated variables. So having one or two variables where it's reasonably certain that even though there were 10,000 possibilities at the start, um, they weren't followed through. Uh, they could be narrowed down very quickly, rather, with the design of a relevant experimental system. One of the things that the taxpayer said is the first tests were performed using parameters at random. So again, that's kind of the antithesis, what they call a trial and error or a random investigation, as opposed to a systematic investigation where the initial possibilities or trials would be thought out ahead of time based on some hypothesis or knowledge of the variables in question, the power levels or whatever, and then honed in, and that each successive operation you would try to understand more and more so that each successive fabric or substrate that you're trying to print on, it would get faster and easier and better. So you'd be developing the technology. Really what they said in here is that there was really no investigation or search, rather a trial and error and process. Since that, according to the expert witness, there was no incompatibilities between the print drivers, and they weren't really learning anything at the end of the day. They didn't learn anything from one tissue to another. The first tests were performed, and then they were repeated again. Okay, so it didn't have the evidence of a typical advancement and learning process.